Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something that sounds simple but really isn't: what actually counts as a psychological disorder.
Yeah, it's a fundamental question.
We've pulled together some really interesting sources to guide us. We've got a solid psychology textbook as a base, but also material looking at, how we develop across our whole lives.
Right, from infancy, adolescence, adulthood,
Yeah,
all the way through.
exactly. Plus, things like attachment, how we develop cognitively thinking about Piaget and Kohlberg, and even the basics like touch and pain and how they fit in.
It all provides context for understanding what's typical and, well, what might not be.
So our mission for you in this deep dive is to get a really clear picture of how professionals actually define these conditions, moving beyond just vague ideas of what seems abnormal.
Exactly. It's less about weird and more about a structured scientific way of looking at things.
Okay, let's dive in then. The first hurdle seems to be just pinning down a definition. It's not always black and white, is it?
Definitely not. So many things we experience, like sadness or anxiety, they exist on a continuum, a spectrum.
A spectrum.
Yeah, feeling a bit blue after a tough day, that's normal. But where does that cross the line into something like, say, clinical depression? The intensity, the duration, how much it messes with your life, that's where it gets complex.
That makes sense. And our textbook makes this really important point early on. Just because something's statistically unusual doesn't make it a disorder.
Right. The red hair example is great for that. It's rare, maybe 4% in the US, but obviously not a disorder. Atypicality isn't the whole story.
So what else matters? Context seems key.
Hugely important. Think about the example given. Someone wearing a heavy coat in July, shouting on the subway. That's definitely unusual, right? Violates social norms.
For sure.
But why are they doing it?
Yeah.
Is it causing them harm? Is it impacting others negatively? That's what pushes it towards potentially being related to a disorder, not just the unusual behavior itself.
Okay, and that brings us to this idea of harmful dysfunction. What's that about? It sounds like it combines two things.
It does. It suggests there are two core components. First, there's some kind of objective breakdown. A dysfunction in normal psychological processes, an internal mechanism isn't working right.
Okay, but breakdown.
And second, crucially, this breakdown has to be harmful. It needs to cause significant distress or impairment for the person, or maybe even for those around them.
So it's not just different, it's actually causing problems.
Right.
Got it. Now, the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, they have a more, let's say, official definition. Our source outlines it.
Yes, the APA definition, which is widely used, sets out several criteria. First up, significant disturbances in thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Significant disturbances.
Yeah, not just minor quirks. These are described as unusual in a negative, self-defeating way. They often cause trouble for the person experiencing them, and sometimes for others too.
Can you give an example?
Well, the book contrasts, like someone feeling compelled to wash their hands 40 times a day or hearing voices, versus, say, normal nervousness before talking to someone attractive or feeling homesick as a college freshman. The level of severity and impairment is just worlds apart.
That really clarifies the scale of disturbance. Okay, what's the next part of the APA definition?
The second point is that these disturbances reflect some underlying dysfunction, biological, psychological, or developmental.
Underlying dysfunction, meaning?
It means the patterns point to a flaw or issue in how the person's internal mechanisms are working. So hallucinations in schizophrenia, for instance, might be linked to specific brain abnormalities. That's a biological aspect.
Okay.
Psychological dysfunction could involve, say, deeply ingrained negative thought patterns. And developmental dysfunction relates to issues in how someone matures or acquires skills over time.
So it's tracing the problem back to some internal source. What else?
Third, and this links back to that harmful idea, these disturbances lead to significant distress or disability in life.
Distress or disability, like it really impacts them.
Exactly. Either the person is suffering a lot personally,
Yeah.
or their ability to function in everyday life, socially, at work, occupationally, is seriously impaired. The example of someone with intense social anxiety avoiding class or job interviews really hits this home. It's not just feeling awkward, it's actively preventing them from doing important things.
That makes total sense. It stops you from living your life fully. And there's a fourth piece to the APA definition.
Yes, the final piece is that the disturbances are not expected or culturally approved responses to common life events.
Ah, the context again.
Right. The reaction has to be outside the bounds of what's considered a normal, socially acceptable response within that person's culture. Grief after losing a loved one, for example, involves intense sadness and maybe withdrawal, But that's generally seen as a normal, expected human reaction, not a disorder in itself.
So, putting it all together, it's got to be a significant disturbance linked to an internal dysfunction causing real-life problems, not just a normal reaction to something tough.
That's a pretty good summary of the core APA criteria.
Now, to really grasp what might be disordered, it seems crucial to understand what's considered, well, ordered or typical development across life. Our sources talk a lot about lifespan development.
Absolutely fundamental. Development isn't just childhood, it's lifelong. From prenatal through infancy, childhood, adolescence, all the stages of adulthood, right up to thinking about death and dying.
And what's considered normal changes drastically across these stages.
Completely. You wouldn't expect the same behaviors or cognitive abilities from a toddler as you would from a teenager or an older adult.
Let's zoom in on adolescence for a moment. That seems like such a period of massive change, roughly ages 10 to 20.
Oh, definitely. You got the obvious physical changes with puberty, but also huge cognitive shifts.
Yeah.
Teenagers start thinking more abstractly, more hypothetically.
But there's that mismatch in brain development, right? The impulse control part lagging behind the sensation-seeking part.
Exactly. The parts of the brain involved in seeking rewards and excitement often mature faster than the prefrontal cortex, which handles planning, judgment, and impulse control. It's like having the accelerator pressed down before the brakes are fully working.
Which can explain some of that classic teenage risk-taking.
Precisely. And then you have the social changes too. Figuring out identity, becoming more independent from parents, peers becoming more important.
And this concept of emerging adulthood, those late teens and 20s, that adds another layer, doesn't it?
It really does. Dr. Yonker's work highlights this distinct period. It helps us understand behaviors that might look concerning out of context.
What are the key features again?
There are 5. Identity exploration, especially around love and work. Instability, changing jobs, relationships, living situations, being self-focused, not selfishly, but more about preparing for the future, feeling kind of in between, not quite an adult, not a teen anymore, and the sense of it being an age of possibilities.
So, bouncing between majors or jobs in your early 20s might just be typical exploration for that stage, not necessarily a sign of a disorder.
Exactly. It provides that developmental lens.
And Erikson's stages, they give an even broader view of social and emotional development across the entire lifespan, right?
Yes. Erikson's 8 stages, each with its psychosocial crisis like trust versus mistrust in infancy, or identity versus role confusion in adolescence, intimacy versus isolation in early adulthood.
Each stage has a challenge to resolve.
And successfully navigating each leads to developing certain strengths or virtues, as he called them: hope, will, purpose, fidelity, love, and so on. It gives us a framework for typical social-emotional growth.
How does that help with disorders?
Well, it provides a benchmark. For instance, struggling intensely with identity is expected in adolescence. But if someone in their, say, late 30s is still completely unable to form a stable sense of self or lasting relationships, that might indicate something more persistent, possibly related to unresolved earlier stages or a potential disorder. It's about the pattern and the persistence.
Okay, shifting to cognitive development, how we think. Piaget's stages are pretty foundational here.
Absolutely. Piaget gave us those 4 key stages: sensoromotor, preoperational, concrete operational, and formal operational.
Can you remind us what they are briefly?
Sure. Sensoromotor, birth to about 2 years, learning through senses and actions, developing object permanence, knowing things exist even when you can't see them. Preoperational, roughly 2 to 7 years, marked by symbolic thought, language, but also egocentrism, difficulty seeing things from another's perspective, and lacking logical operations like conservation.
Like not getting that the amount of water stays the same in a different shaped glass?
Exactly. Then concrete operational, 7 to 11, where logical thinking about concrete things develops, they grasp conservation. And finally, formal operational, adolescence onwards, allowing for abstract thought and hypothetical reasoning.
And understanding these helps us know what's typical thinking for a certain age.
Precisely. It helps differentiate between, say, a 5-year-old's normal egocentrism and what might be a more significant social cognitive issue in an older child or adult, or distinguishing typical pre-logical thinking from signs of a cognitive disorder.
And Kohlberg adds the moral dimension to this developmental picture.
Right. Kohlberg focused on how our moral reasoning develops, moving through pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional stages. It's about the why behind moral decisions, not just the decisions themselves. Useful context if you're looking at disorders involving social rule following or ethical behavior.
So it's becoming really clear. You absolutely need this developmental backdrop, cognitive, social, moral, to even begin to assess what might be atypical or disordered behavior.
Couldn't agree more. Context is everything.
Okay, let's pivot slightly now and think about some of the underlying building blocks, our biology and our environment, and how they interact.
Yeah, the sources on touch, pain, and attachment are really relevant here. Touch, for example, is our first sense. It's incredibly vital, especially early on.
Harlow's monkey studies come to mind.
Exactly. Showing that contact comfort was even more crucial than food for the infant monkey's sense of security. And sadly, the studies on children in deprived environments, like some Romanian orphanages, showed the profound negative developmental impact of lacking sufficient touch and nurturing interaction.
Wow. And pain.
Pain is also fundamental. It's a warning system, obviously crucial for survival, but it has both sensory and emotional or affective components. And chronic pain shows how this system can become dysregulated, impacting overall well-being significantly. Disruptions here can certainly affect psychological health.
And then there's attachment theory. That seems huge for emotional development.
Absolutely. Bowlby's core idea was that infants are biologically wired to form attachments with caregivers. It's a survival mechanism. Consistent, responsive care creates a secure base.
A secure base.
Yeah, a safe haven from which the child can explore the world and return to for comfort. And it's not just about being fed, it's about that responsiveness and connection.
And these early patterns stick with us.
Research, like Hazan and Shaver's work, suggests they really do. Our early attachment styles, secure, or various forms of insecure, like anxious or avoidant, tend to shape our expectations and behaviors in adult romantic relationships.
How does that relate to psychological disorders?
Well, difficulties in forming secure attachments early on, perhaps due to inconsistent or neglectful caregiving, are considered a risk factor. They can contribute to difficulties managing emotions, forming healthy relationships later in life, and might increase vulnerability to conditions like anxiety disorders, depression, or personality disorders.
It really emphasizes that interplay between early experience, biology, and later functioning.
Definitely.
Now, to kind of pull some of these threads together, our sources use ADHD as a case study. It's common, especially in kids, but seems complex.
ADHD is a really good example, actually. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It really illustrates many of the challenges we've been talking about.
What are the core issues with ADHD?
The main symptoms fall into two clusters. Inattention, things like difficulty staying focused, organizing tasks, losing things, being easily distracted, and hyperactivity impulsivity like constant fidgeting, difficulty staying seated, interrupting others, trouble waiting your turn.
And diagnosis can be tricky.
Very, especially in active children.
Mm.
Where's the line between normal childhood energy or distractibility and clinically significant ADHD? Plus, there are different presentations, some primarily inattentive, some primarily hyperactive impulsive, some combined.
Does it go away?
For many, no. Symptoms often persist into adulthood. The estimate is around 4.4% of adults meet the criteria. And untreated adult ADHD can lead to real problems, academic struggles, job issues, relationship difficulties, even higher rates of substance use or accidents.
But treatment can help.
Yes, treatment can be very effective. Which brings up another interesting aspect. The treatment approaches themselves highlight that bioenvironment interaction. Well, you have stimulant medications, like Adderall. They work on brain chemistry to help improve focus and impulse control. But they have potential side effects.
Yeah.
And there's ongoing debate about potential overprescription.
Right.
Then you have behavioral interventions, things like token economies, parent training and behavior management, structured routines, daily report cards between school and home. These focus on changing the environment and teaching coping skills.
And often a combination is used.
Often, yes. The success of both kinds of approaches underscores that ADHD likely involves biological predispositions interacting with environmental factors and developmental pathways. It's not just one thing.
So ADHD really encapsulates the complexity, the developmental context, the biological factors, the functional impairment, and the challenges in definition and treatment.
Exactly. It's a microcosm of the bigger picture.
Okay, so as we sort of bring this deep dive towards a close, it feels like the main takeaway is that defining a psychological disorder isn't simple. It's this complex judgment call.
It really is. You have to weigh multiple factors. Is the behavior statistically rare? Is it just unusual, or is it causing real harm or distress? Does it impair functioning? Is it outside cultural norms? Is there evidence of an underlying biological, psychological, or developmental dysfunction?
And overlaying all of that is the absolute necessity of understanding typical human development across the entire lifespan.
You got it. You need that baseline knowing what's typical cognitive development, social emotional milestones, physical changes at different ages, to be able to identify when something might truly be a significant deviation warranting attention.
Conditions like ADHD just remind us that our understanding is always evolving too. Science progresses, definitions might get refined, treatment approaches change.
It's a dynamic field for sure.
We've covered a lot of ground today, really unpacking the layers involved in defining psychological disorders. Hopefully, listening to this, you feel you have a much better handle on the criteria professionals use and just how nuanced this all is.
Yeah, it's far from just slapping a label on someone.
Definitely. So think about how these ideas, these definitions, these developmental frameworks might influence how you understand human behavior, maybe even your own experiences or those of people you know.
Were there any aha moments for you listening along? Things that clicked into place?
And maybe this discussion sparked more questions for you, perhaps about specific disorders we didn't cover, or more about the fine line between normal struggles and clinical conditions.
Which is great, because this deep dive, really, it's just scratching the surface of a vast and incredibly fascinating area of psychology and human experience.